Thank you, Alex, for your introduction and invitation. It's an honor to be with you today. I accepted this invitation for several reasons. One, the importance of the topic and the fact that there is work being done today that is encouraging, and this work involves the kind of folks who are studying here at Thayer School of Engineering. So this is an introduction to hopefully a conversation that will continue beyond today. My perspective on this subject has to do with my involvement with the Meadows Institute. First of all, that's a new name. For 15 years, the Sustainability Institute has been located in the Upper Valley. Question for all of you, how many of you have heard of Donella Meadows? That's great. I was at Davos, Switzerland. This is the truth for the World Resources Forum we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And in the course of social conversations with 400 people, with a nice intergenerational mix, very much like the group here today, probably about the same, 2 generations, there were more people who recognized her name than there were people who immediately said, "Oh, Dartmouth College, I know where it is and what it's all about." I say that with a great deal of respect for this institution, but I only say it because I want to stress the fact that Donella Meadows has had an enormous impact on a number of people's lives, including people all over the world. The Institute was founded in 1996, about the time when I first met Dana. I had known her briefly when she was on the board of the Upper Valley Land Trust in the early 90s, one of the founders. For some of you who are long-termers are aware of that. And at that time, I served as the director of Twin Pines Housing Trust, and we met there. But I went to her office in the late 90s with one objective, to reconnect with her around the subject of sustainability, and specifically on the subject of ecological economics. So I went over to her office during her office hours and was invited in, and gracious woman, charming, and told her why I'd come. And she said, "What do you do?" And I told her. She said, "I'll make you a deal. I will tell you everything I know about ecological economics if you help me build a co-housing community I'm planning to build down in Heartland, which will be called Cobb Hill." I said, "Great." So the fact is, I signed on for that and enjoyed the process. The community has been built. It's been a successful addition to our area. But Dana never got around to telling me what she knew about ecological economics. And that's very illustrative to the subject today, which is 15 years ago, we were working in 2 different camps. We had our scientists and our environmentalists, and we had our economists, and there wasn't a lot of dialogue between the two. Today, the world has changed, and I will show you the thesis of this talk in just a second, but interdisciplinary approaches are essential. We know that. It's happening here on this campus with the leadership of your president around the issue of healthcare delivery involving Thayer, Tuck, and the medical school in ways that I'm told by those who are working on that are very, very encouraging. I think we have the same opportunity now in the subject that we're talking about today, which has to do with a new economy, one that is here for the long term, and that involves the work of engineers, folks at the business school, folks at the Vermont Law School, and folks up at the Gun School, the Gun Institute at the University of Vermont. That's a little bit of a perspective on why I accepted, and I welcome a continuing conversation with you and our institute. So the thesis of the talk is on the screen now. And it's a serious subject, as we all know. I'm sure all of us are familiar with the state of affairs today, and I think this represents a fairly reasoned description of where we are at the moment. Essentially, we are reaching that point that Dana talked about 15 years ago, 40 years ago, when the book Limits to Growth was written in 1972. Dana and Dennis, who's a former faculty at Thayer, as some of you know. Dennis gave a talk in Boston about 3 years ago to the Society of, to the Social Systems Dynamic Society in Boston, the annual conference, and he said we made one mistake with that book. He said that we chose the wrong title, Limits to Growth, a very unfashionable idea and one that didn't have a lot of traction. Had we titled the book Overshoot and Collapse, he felt that there would have been a more serious response to the message of the book. So that's the thesis of today's talk. And before we get into the concept that I'm prepared to present to you today, I'd just like to spend a minute on what we'll call a glossary of some terms that may not be familiar to all of you. How many of you in here are essentially from the engineering perspective? Great. And but general readership of the world of current affairs today would take us to some of these terms, but I cite them up here. Ecosystem services. This is huge. This is something that's been buried, so far as I know. Alex mentioned that I did study economics, both undergrad and graduate school, and the notion of ecosystem services was never discussed. And when you look at the fact that by some calculations, the value of those services is on the order of about 2/3 of the value of the world economy. It's huge, and for it to be essentially not incorporated into the analysis of doing economic planning is a serious issue, and goes to one of the fundamental flaws in the view of many of our current economic system. Biocapacity, this is a term that you're probably familiar with as well. It's pretty self-explanatory. Ecological footprint is a concept that's gaining more and more awareness, which is essentially describing the capacity of the Earth to meet consumption demands as measured by the criteria you see there. Ecological economics, the centerpiece of what we hope will be a new economy, is simply the integration of human economies with natural ecosystems. The economy, very importantly, is treated as a subset of the ecosystem, and preserving natural capacity is a necessity. Genuine progress indicators, some of you have heard this term. It's being discussed as an alternative to the flawed GNP, which is the term we use today to define our economic health. The big difference there, of course, is that consumption is adjusted for non-monetized activities that have some social benefit. That's a term that's sometimes called the core economy. It doesn't get measured, but it's critical to a healthy society. And then the other one is more subjective, unsustainable consumption and income distribution. So those are a few terms that are germane to what we're going to be talking about today. Now let's take a look. It's January 2012 at the state of the world, and then we'll take a look at our region. On the left here we have a global perspective. Worldwide population has reached 7 billion this past year, as we know. Humanity is now demanding more than the Earth can provide. In 2007, the footprint essentially reached a point of 150% of our capacity is expected to become 200% of our capacity in another 20 years with 9 billion people. The next paragraph is extremely sobering and I think undeniable. The world's scientists who do climate science are clear about the fact that this is not just global warming that's underway, but the positive feedback loops are in place now, and that has a very significant message that is undeniable in terms of its effect on our civilization. Meanwhile, the global economy that we have with mobile capital and open markets is disrupting cultures, communities, and livelihoods at really what is an unprecedented rate. The movement of people across this earth, the resettlement for opportunity, either where they're going or where they're leaving, that others are seeking, is a significant phenomenon. And then finally, the one that has grabbed the headlines in the last few years, moving from financial market debt to sovereign debt, consumer debt running as a thread across the whole timeline, is the impact of accumulation of debt, concentration of wealth, and the last statement, democratic societies are dissipating. Well, by that we mean that the influence of wealth on the political process is pretty indisputable today, at least in the United States of America, and that's a concern. So in essence, we're faced with an economic system designed for growth, while the Earth's biocapacity is telling us we're already exceeding the limits to growth. Here in the Upper Valley, the situation's a little different. We just celebrated the 250th anniversary of the colonial charters for the river towns. The 69-town region defined by the vital communities or nonprofit service area is a distinctive bioregion which holds enormous opportunity as we go forward with the proposal. We have a common identity, we have strong local economy, we have congruent values. That's a set of circumstances I would submit that is somewhat unusual. This is a special combination of circumstances in a region that's fairly small and congruent. However, we lack a vision for our future. We anticipate growth here, and we don't have an organization really that's chartered to do this. But, and this is very heartening, the civic community, and by that I mean vital communities, which has taken the lead in this, our institute, the Meadows Institute, and the 3 regional planning commissions, the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Commission, the Two Rivers Ottaquechee, and the Southern Windsor Commissions are all banding together. All 3 have been funded thanks to a federal program to encourage sustainable communities, regional planning, to take a look at this area, and we'll come back to this later. That's the state of the world as many of us see it today. So, those are our challenges. What are our options? It seems to me that we can distill our options into 3 fundamental choices. We can reboot business as usual and grow in whatever manner possible to address what captures the headlines. How do we create jobs and reduce debt? I would submit most of the conversation nationally is around this very subject. This is sort of the limits of the conversation so far as I've been able to tell. That's one option. Another option is to retain this system, refine it, make it better, make sure we do smart growth, and I'll give Gus Speth, I would like to acknowledge his insight on this. He, as many of you know, former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, Environmental Studies, and now serving on the faculty at the Vermont Law School, has done a lot of thinking and writing on this subject. And his point is that it's possible to secure a high quality of life in a fortress setting and essentially remove ourselves from what is otherwise going on in the larger world. And that's an option that I know in talking with a lot of folks in our area that is very seductive simply because we cherish the high quality of life. We're puzzled about the system that we have, and that seems to be, for those who want to do something, sort of the default position. And I would suggest we have a third option, which is a transition to a new system where scale and common values will permit it, such as our area here, and we integrate the economy within the ecological system. That's the underlying direction for this so-called third way. And before we talk about that, I think it would be useful to look at some of the shortfalls of our current model. So let's do that. So we'll call the current operating system, this is a term that doesn't get used much anymore, but I think it's very descriptive of the system that we have today, laissez-faire capitalism, which is provides a lot of opportunity and freedom both on the economic side and within the political arena to maximize efficiency opportunities and to achieve wealth and success, and hopefully of benefit to society as well. There's no denying that the system has been very successful in rising billions of people throughout the world to a higher standard of living than they enjoyed before. So let's look at the factors of production in an economy and also the production system itself. It's a good way, I think, of analyzing this current model we have today. The goals, as I say, are very growth-oriented. We talk about what do we say when someone says, "How's the economy?" Well, we talk about GNP. Interestingly enough, it's all about the unemployment rate as opposed to what's the employment rate. There's a gap between between those who want to work in art that isn't really being discussed or reported a great deal. And of course, if you turn on public radio, you'll always hear how the stock market did. That's sort of the, those are the three benchmarks in terms of how we're doing. Now, within the factors of production, the mere terminology is sort of indicative of a set of perspectives and values. In the economics textbooks, Macroeconomics 101, we talk about the factors of production as being land, labor, and capital. Well, the ecological economists, going back to the 50s with Herman Daly and Paul Hawken, immediately moved to different terms: natural capital, human capital, and of course financial capital. And that has to do with ecological resources, workforce, and banking, investment, and business. The production system is simply that: production of goods and services, distribution, what kind of infrastructure we rely upon to do that distribution, and what are our consumption patterns. The current system involves what I would suggest is rather minimal protection of natural resources, which is enabled by legalized property rights. Labor is viewed principally as a commodity. Capital is mobile and debt-driven or investor-driven in terms of expectations around returns. Growth is needed to repay loans. Production is oriented toward efficiency and big scale to secure market positions. With free markets, we have access to new markets and pricing power. And under our infrastructure system today, I would suggest that we have rudimentary zoning and infrastructure links, which folks around here are aware of, and it's great to see that we're taking that on in the city of Lebanon particularly, I think. And we have a legal system, again, that's tipped toward individual freedoms. Another piece, the final piece: citizens are incentivized to buy to keep the economy growing as opposed to buying to meet needs. Big difference. So what are the limits and failings? Here is the list, which you can read through. Two major points here. One, we have some measurement problems. One, for many of us, GDP is not the proper measure of economic activity in terms of social well-being. Two, we fail to do cost accounting to factor in the value of those ecological services that represent a significant portion of the economic activity of the world, even though they're not counted. So we've got two measurement problems. And then we have some built-in inconsistencies that in a world of some finite limitations simply ensures that breakdown is really inevitable. Not just over exploitation of resources, but we have a model that really high-tech called a century ago creative destruction. We can see very easily on trips such as to the Sun Belt, where you have generations of shopping centers that simply are stacked up there like a piece of archives from a period of time when they were the sort of the latest model, only to be replaced by one more ring out. That's expensive. We pay the price for all that material economy that was built and isn't being used. And the debt accumulation it creates problems as well. People are induced to do things to repay that debt that aren't necessarily in our best interest. True market signals are missing. And we have reached a point now where we have this inequality of wealth where worldwide the world's richest 20% consume 80% of the world's resources. So that's a critique of our current system. Should we keep it, or is it worth taking a look at some alternatives? Should we keep going? Okay. So, for a long time, a lot of great books have been written on this subject by some very talented people, without really a name being ascribed to the so-called new economic model. And I'm just going to suggest that we call it regional stewardship. And you'll see why that name, I think, makes some sense. There are essentially three prerequisites. It's very interesting that we're both at a crossroads in terms of the future, but we also have a dovetailing now of new economics with regionalism. Both are becoming much more accepted, being studied, being looked at in terms of what they can offer us in terms of a way ahead that's viable. So there are three pieces to this. One is ecological economics, and that means building a material economy, the things that have to do with physical aspects, raw materials, construction, manufacturing, utilities, that sort of thing, as opposed to services, and that's where Thayer School comes in. You guys are already working on pieces of this now, I know. The next one, it doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think it's critical. In addition to the economy, we have the regulatory regime. We have the institutional framework, the cultural and legal framework within which the economy must operate. And I would suggest to you that we could, we'll call it the stewardship style. It doesn't mean the end of private ownership, doesn't mean the end of competition, but it means putting some brakes on and putting some counterbalance into that process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Rural regions. Why? Think for a moment that this new economy, in my view, essentially, you can break it down into four quadrants. Let's think about the world. We have the global north, the global south. The global north that's urbanized, the global north that's rural, the global south that's urbanized, and the global south that's rural. Which quadrant are we in? Somebody? We're in the global north rural. Okay. Which is a position that gives us an opportunity to implement this concept that we're talking about. We have a strong dependence on and access to natural resources. We have a common identity, as I mentioned before, through a shared culture and values. And so because of the access of a small area and the scale that we have, the probability I would suggest to you is highest. I suggest to you, as President Jim Wright said to me last summer, Bill, if we can't do this here, where can we? And that was a pretty, I think, valid challenge that was called up there. What are the characteristics of the new model? It's inspired by nature's long-term operating system for bioregions, integrated whole systems, ecological, economic, political, and cultural. Here, the next two are very, very important. Efficiency and resilience, competition and cooperation. They're not mutually exclusive. We do better when we have both. We learned that from nature, and we need to find a way to provide room for these two ideas to be part of our discussion today. Isn't happening on the national scene to any great extent. I come from the business world, I believe in it, but these are valuable components to long-term success and survival. And then perhaps go back to your European history 4 or 5 centuries, 6 centuries ago. Remember the leagues, the Baltic League, and the League of Cities on the Rhine. It may be that we'll create a network, a league of regional stewardship initiatives. That's the promise, the opportunity that we have before us. So goals, best case, we decouple economic activity from resource overconsumption. The 20% of the regional economy that's related to construction, raw materials, manufacturing, and utilities is the piece that we tackle, and presumably that has the opportunity to impact 80% of our society. One way of looking at it. Worst case, okay, if we rebuild our economy, and I would suggest there's less here. We're starting at a point that's enviable from most people's perspective. But if we rebuild from the bottom up, put ourselves through a different set of criteria in terms of how we want to go about operating our economy, we will create resilient regions. And those regions, I would suggest, and others who are pragmatists, the eco-pragmatists as they're called, means that such regions will have a fate that's more self-determined and less left outside forces. And that's an important risk management perspective to take on this whole subject, I would suggest. So how do we go about introducing a regional stewardship economy with the 3 components that I mentioned, ecological economics, economic democracy, and rural regions? What are the principal strategies to do this? Well, I would suggest we need to stretch the supply side of the economy, and we need to reduce the demand for material goods. How do we do that? That's getting to the core of the challenge for this new economy. On the stretching side, and this is what the World Resources Forum is focused on, this is happening all over the world. It's happening within industries that may or may not ever become part of a regional stewardship initiative. They may be, Boeing aircraft has just introduced their Dreamliner, which is a material light product versus their previous generation. So this is not specific to the regional area, but is critical to a dematerialized kind of economy. So we do resource efficient, green, circular. We achieve more with less. That's the technical challenge. On the demand side, and this is very tough, and this is where we run up against all kinds of subjective and cultural issues. Question is, how do we get from where we are now in terms of consumption patterns to achieving this ethic of sufficiency? We'll talk about this in a minute, but I would suggest that we've got to look at those two factors of production that were called labor and land, and think of them as the workforce, as people who are empowered in the workplace and have a stake in it, and land as natural resources, and also capital as in financial capital that we have some control over, as in local financial institutions, investment in, et cetera. So the thesis here is that if we put more emphasis on those factors of production, financial and labor in particular, build strong institutions, people will come to a conclusion, as many people I know in this Upper Valley, and many of you are in this room today, that the so-called notion of the diet for a small planet is a good thing. You can live with that and deal with it, and it's acceptable. It's easier, as we know, for those of us who are over a certain age to look at life this way, because we gain a certain amount of wisdom and also a certain amount of recognition of the reality of life, and make those choices much easier at a certain age now than perhaps the next generation. So this is the stewardship challenge. Let's look at the technical challenge for a moment. And essentially, as I was saying before, if you look at our economy and its overall composition, agriculture, industry, manufacturing, services. As we know in the U.S., that this is the breakdown here. Globally, slightly less skewed to services than here. And in Vermont and New Hampshire, we're fairly typical, although a little lower in manufacturing than the nation as a whole. Where does the industry and manufacturing component break out? Well, there are economic sectors that the Commerce Department uses in publishing their reports, Bureau of Economic Activity, utilities, agriculture, forest and mining, construction, manufacturing. This is the so-called material economy, which represents somewhere 23% of the overall economy. This is the piece that we're going after, not the service piece, trade, transit, services, and government. So just to sort of frame the discussion in terms of where do we introduce this new approach into the overall economy, it's in these sectors here. And we also do it keeping in mind the classic product cycle, from sourcing materials, designing, producing, production methods, distribution, consumption, and very importantly, disposal. What are the principles? These are some right here that are very common today. We think about. The idea is to begin to get a holistic view of this rather than sort of picking off pieces here and there and not understanding where they fit into the entire game plan, as it were. What are some of the systems tools? Assessing ecological services, eco-innovation, system analysis, life cycle assessment. What are some of the strategies? There are strategies, many of you are in this room are working on them, particularly around energy. There's great work being done in the state of Vermont today on a food plan, a strategic plan. Construction is changing. We just completed a LEED certified building. It's a good feeling. We're moving in the right direction. All this helps. And manufacturing, as I mentioned before, they're great examples of that. So that's a look at the technical side. Now let's look at the economic democracy question. So if we've made some progress on the supply side, if we get better at, and keep in mind, the problem we're facing, and this is why it's so daunting, is that we can make progress on the technical side in terms of a green, resource-efficient economy, but we're doing it in a backdrop of a global population moving from 7 to 9 billion, and with standards of living moving into the middle class. So worldwide demand will eat up most of those gains. Doesn't mean we ignore the challenge, but we have to be realistic in terms of the impact of those improvements on the overall picture. So how can we make progress on the demand side, the so-called diet for a small planet? Well, there are theories of change. Some of you are familiar with them. Motivational theories. Once people have secured a sense of economic well-being, they move from the profit motive to the purpose motive. There are organizational theories. Peter Senge down at MIT with the Society of Organizational Learning has talked a lot, and his colleagues, Otto Scharmer, on the U theory. Organizations get together, they go into retreat, they reflect on their practices. Some of you may have already been involved in this, and come out of those kinds of reflections with a commitment to do business differently, change supply chains. One of the organizations that has come out of the Meadows Institute is called the Sustainable Food Lab, which is still based down in Heartland. It's doing work all over the world, and they've done a tremendous amount of work on this subject right here with good success. They are changing the food system around the world with the big players, the Unilevers and General Foods of the world, as well as the smallholders in the global south. Cultural is part of this as well. Resistance to change, where the status quo is actually favorable is valuable, and those places where it doesn't exist a sense of a cultural identity, I would submit to you it's important to build that up, that's very helpful. One's willingness to forgo for themselves, for sort of the community, is more easily achieved where you share values and you feel there's something worth saving, as it were. So the common denominator for all of this really is security and trust. And how do we achieve security? Well, I would suggest, again, we look at community-based enterprises. This area is very rich in such examples. We do worker empowerment through ownership. We've got great examples of that here coming from Dartmouth educated folks. Hyperserve, Dick Couch's company, came right out of Thayer. Employee stock ownership company. We have Resource Systems Group, co-founded by Dennis Meadows and Tom Adler. Dennis, former faculty here. Employee stock ownership plan. King Arthur Flour, Frank Sand's company, now being run by the next generation, and a Tuck grad as well, Steve Voigt, over in Norwich. That's important. Community financial capital. There's a group right now in Vermont called the Monetary Policy Group. They've just introduced legislation this week in Montpelier to create a state bank, such as the one in North Dakota. I'm not sure it will fly this year, but there's a clear desire on the part of a lot of folks in the state of Vermont to explore how to achieve greater self-sufficiency around the monetary system so that it's working for the people as opposed to being in a position of great dependency. And now we come to the next piece in terms of security, a sense of a community that's well planned, well managed, and good policy. Collaboration is key, regulatory framework that makes sense in terms of smart spatial development is a big efficiency payoff here. Again, we are trying to do more with less. Municipal governments are strapped. We're talking about cutbacks in services right now. And the more we are able to plan and position our infrastructure in a smart way, that will pay off as well. And then really developing policies. I'll never forget Jeff Inveld, who spoke here this summer. as part of the Leading Thinkers series, saying that this is the only country in the markets they're dealing with around the world that really doesn't have an energy policy. We've got to create policies. If you use the word industrial policy, in some conversations people say that's socialism. It isn't. It's being done by countries all over the world that are part of the capitalist system, but understand having conversations with the public sector, the private sector, universities, around education, and also tax strategies to create incentives to move in the right direction is absolutely essential. We need to arrive at sufficiency. These steps, I would submit, will be helpful. It's a huge job. We don't have a lot of examples. We have eco-communities. We have examples around here, but it's kind of a foreign territory right now in the developed world. So let's look at the new model now versus the laissez-faire model. New model, to summarize, the goals are limits to growth. We need to stretch the supply side, reduce the demand side. We need to safeguard those ecological assets. One way of doing that is with a common asset trust, where those assets are held in trust by the public. The Alaskan Oil Fund is such an example. There are folks in Vermont who are talking about the same for critical ecological resources for the same reason. We need to engage labor stakeholders, establish new working time policies. This is a very interesting subject. As we come to the recognition that high growth is unsustainable and we opt for a lower growth or a steady state, as some have suggested, how do we keep everybody employed? Well, that involves looking at new working time policy as one way of getting fuller employment, but not necessarily 60-hour work weeks as sort of you're in or you're out in the labor force kind of arena. Invest in community capital. These are all responses to the features of the system we're in now. Price ecological services. Sooner or later, looking at some sort of green tax to do this is inevitable. It's just a question of when we're willing to take it on. Free markets for fair trade, true competition, reduce supply chains, lower carbon footprint. Go for smart spatial development, increase efficiency. Build social capital, foster an ethic of sufficiency, diet for a small planet. That's a summary. These 8 pieces here of what this so-called regional stewardship capitalism looks like. And it's really designed from an economic and a political regulatory framework with an understanding of the cultural values that go beneath that as a foundation for everything. So onward, what are the next steps? We're in an academic institution this afternoon, Friday afternoon late, but we come to the academy because we have a certain amount of awareness. We come to learn, and I would suggest this is what we would call literacy, getting to understand the concepts. We need to develop skills, and the Thayer School is a big part of that. And then we move to application. What's our story? We desperately need a new narrative. We need to be in a position where people can articulate what an alternative direction is and what are the fundamental components of that. And we need role models. Where to start? Where the Great River Rises, the title of the wonderful atlas that was published a few years ago, talking about this phenomenal area, the Upper Connecticut River Valley, from an economic, from a political, natural history perspective. So we do plan to start with this Upper Valley 2020 vision for the future, with the 3 regional planning commissions, with vital communities, and with the Meadows Institute, as a way to help demonstrate some of the regional stewardship ideas I've talked with you today. So how will we know if we're making progress? I would like each of you to reflect for a moment on what your own definition of someone says, how are we doing? How would you respond? What would you look at in terms of a way of being able to speak to that subject? I would like to answer the question for myself with a little illustration. I live in town. I walk through this campus almost every day, and I walk past the green, and I've walked by the Occupy Dartmouth encampment regularly, and I've stopped and talked occasionally to some of those folks, and if I've asked them when I've spoken to them, what would you like to see, the responses are vague. There are more posters today, so that's a sign of more thinking or articulating. But my own sense of how do we know if we're making progress, if a week from now or 2 weeks from now or 2 months from now, walking past there, someone says to me, Bill, we need a regional stewardship economy. We need to do it on the basis of ecological economics, an economic democracy, a real economic democracy, and we do it in a region such as our own. And we know that it involves strategies that have to do with stretching the supply, curbing our demand. That's what we need to do, and this is the place that we think we have our best opportunity at doing that. Who are we? The new logo for the Meadows Institute. We're global citizens. That's what Dana called us, and that's what we are. Thank you very much. Sure.
Yeah, Fred Peterson from Economics. Kind of intrigued with the idea of the fortress economy and just having a group of people decide they're going to do things a certain way, which might include, including the cost of what they're doing to the environment and to the cost of manufacturing stuff. But ultimately, it is more expensive to do it that way. And at the end of the day, how do you get people to buy that stuff as opposed to going down to Walmart? I mean, do you have to have tariffs, or do you just convince people they ought to not go to Walmart?
That's a big question. The local food movement is doing very well here. There's a bit of a premium on locally produced food. It's an unequal playing field, and we really have to address it on that basis. It's an unequal playing field for sure. The food industry is concerned with fair trade. That's one way of addressing that question. Get the pricing mechanism leveled out so that the true price is reflected in the product. That's notwithstanding the fact that we are also at a point in history where we have this massive acceleration of societies raising their standards of living based upon their competitive advantage of being low-cost producers with low labor. We know that manufacturing, in some cases, is moving from China to Vietnam because the wage rates change. I do think personally, I know that when you raise the question of tariffs, people immediately say, oh, remember the Depression, remember Smoot-Hawley, remember, that just led to a spiral downward. I think that most countries use tariffs, they don't like to talk about it, to protect industries that are interested in embryonic industries that are interested in seeing get up and get legs and get running, and then you fly on your own. So there's a bit of that piece to your question as well. But I think having honest conversations about this as opposed to skewing the conversations to what's playing for the audience is desperately needed. And that's where I think we've been suffering more and more. And I hope that the universities will take the lead in encouraging open discussions, having teach-ins on this subject in a way that will allow people to feel there's a forum where good ideas can be exchanged and not be immediately categorized or politicized. Next question. Yep.
During your talk, I'm interested in, you're giving some examples, but I wonder, obviously you've been thinking a lot about this and what it might look like. Obviously we're in our situation today based on certain, let's call them economic equations that lead to, or have led to, like sprawl, have had a bunch of the economy, the manufacturing, the policy and land management, all leading to this positive feedback loop that gives us sprawl and then starts making us cost so much more to do everything and kind of eventually got to this problem. But it worked very well for a long time. And I was wondering that in this new regional stewardship economy, one of the strengths of the old system was that it was easy. Everybody could kind of take it off the shelf. And it was distributed such that a lot of individual people could make these very small decisions that worked very well to feed that same positive feedback. So as you're rethinking this to kind
Well, two things. One, you're right. The old system was very useful during the industrial age. It was extremely efficient in an era of when Manifest Destiny was our operating system in the 19th century. But what I've found fascinating in thinking about this is that we are a very sports-oriented culture. We love our sports, and in sports, as we all know, you have a game plan. And you have a game plan that is not static. It's not the same plan for the first, second, third quarter. We're in the football season. Things change in your plan vis-a-vis the state of the game that you're in or the point in the cycle that you're at. Certainly for aging people, our game plans are changing by definition. So why wouldn't we, the U.S., Canada, our global north developed nations, and some are, talking about a game plan that's appropriate for the state that we're in right now? It's that honest assessment. We're not where we were. It's great to be nostalgic, but it's of little use to reflect on how it once was and just sort of wished for the same, because that time is gone. And that time, for better or worse, the lessons from that time can't be applied to today given the reality of where we are. Medicine knows this. You change your dietary practices, your lifestyle practices based upon where you are. And we have to, I think, incorporate those analogies that people can relate to. Sports and medicine, most people can relate to is, oh yeah, the game plan needs to change because circumstances are different. Next question.
It's the same question. All right, thanks.
Eric.
There's no question that the GDP is taking the world right into the brick wall, or over a cliff, or whatever you want to use for a metaphor. Are there working examples or places where genuine progress indicators have been defined, where there are draft attempts to measure a certain region or a city, or are there countries that are perhaps moving more toward a GPI type assessment of what's really happening, not just money spent, that begins to reflect a better way to guide a nation or a region forward? Are there places out there?
Well, Vermont is doing it, and there's an initiative again to make that official policy. I would suggest until it becomes official, we could do it unofficially. My dream, in all honesty, is that we do an annual State of the Region, the Upper Valley region, state of Vermont, what have you, New Hampshire, and we essentially do that kind of reporting. We build public awareness that essentially reflects a more accurate description of what's going on, so people have a sense of where we are there. I think this is really where the civic side of our society really has to step up and move forward, and then hope we can get that assimilated into the official reporting of countries or states. Who else?
I just wanted to give a specific example. When we moved here, we wanted to buy a house. You go to an attorney and have the attorney help you. Our attorney said, I won't work with you unless you will get a loan from a local bank.
Mm-hmm.
So we got a loan from Ledger Bank,
Yeah.
and maybe it was 0.25% higher or something, but the amount higher was sort of in the noise, really.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we've had a very good banking relationship with a local bank. So the message is that it can be done by individuals that insist on it being done as part of the ethos and the culture of the area.
Mm-hmm. That's a good example. Bob?
It seems that a couple of folks said the system worked, but I mean, it really only worked because we weren't valuing things that should be valued, that are limited and they aren't, they weren't being used sustainably. And it seems to me that everybody's expectations were built on I can get more and more, and not really counting the value of these things that were
Thank you.
Bill, if I may ask you a
Sure.
question. It seems to me that you've ignored a very important factor in there, which is population. If one were to reduce individual consumption by some amount, it will only be a fairly short time before we reach a population level where the level of consumption of natural resources is the same again. That needs to be addressed if we are to be going anywhere with that.
That's a fair question. I did mention the fact that notwithstanding progress we can make and are making, the backdrop is moving from 7 to 9 billion and having standards of living rising in the so-called BRIC countries right now, which is a tsunami of sorts in terms of material demands. So that's a reality. And again, for the eco-pragmatists in the room, regional resilience is one response to that. If we're not able to essentially stretch the supply side globally or reduce the demand side globally to the degree we need to stay within the biocapacity limits of the Earth, regional resilience means that local ownership, local stewardship of common assets, natural resources, will be of some value in terms of how things shake out when some of the grandchildren of folks in this room are coming of age, and so on and so forth. That's the only way I can respond to that. Mike?
David Kalman in his recently published book, Thinking Fast and Slow, has made some fairly pessimistic observations about how our minds work and how difficult it is to move from what you remember about history to the reality of history so that you can see the direction you need to go in. How do we mobilize all of these disparate minds so that the buffalo herd goes in the right direction?
Well, I guess one suggestion is to turn off some of the messages that are coming your way. Two is to hang around with people who can reinforce a mindset. I mean, we do this. In high school, everybody sort of found a clique of friends who maybe shared their values, and that gave you the strength to get through the experience in some ways. Yeah, I think social capital is important. I think, and that's why I think this area has the great opportunity, because I think we have a critical mass of people who believe in it and want to do it. There's another piece to this. I do think organizationally we need to, as the term I've suggested is, we need to synchronize these efforts, and that's what many people are saying, for sure, and then we need to scale them up. And it's ironic because we scaled down the global economic problems, but we need to scale up our efforts. And there are a lot of nonprofits I know that are doing heroic work, but a little more synchronization of those efforts, a little bit more of sort of consolidating and then getting to a point where you can hit that leverage point and really make a difference. I think we're coalescing in the energy efforts right now. The Vital Communities is doing some work and pulling together people that are doing it independently to coordinate that, so there's a sense of a greater impact than otherwise would be the case. I think we're at that tipping point in terms of willingness to do it, and certainly we don't want individual efforts that are noble but somewhat sort of self-serving. I need to keep my job as, whatever, and I want to pick you as the winner, not you, but let's look at where we have enough in common so we can scale up and have an impact. I think that's key in terms of implementing the plan. Yep.
It seems to me that what you're really discussing in a lot of ways is the deconstruction of one system, and through that also the construction of a new one.
Correct.
But I feel like what's often happened is that as that previous system has either kind of either gone through deconstruction or self-destruction, there is a huge incentive to perpetuate it continually. That there is the fear that the collapsing of that previous system is in itself the ultimate destruction of everything. So what's the proper relationship between the construction of a new system within this larger one, which in many ways is supported to not be destroyed or to not be removed?
Well, I would again, come back to our area is a great case study, a great model to look at. I think the number is well into the 70 or 80% or more of employees in this area, people whose livelihoods are in this area, who work in organizations that are locally owned and locally controlled. That gives you a big head start in terms of your ability to make decisions and not have to go to corporate headquarters on the other side of the continent to get a sign-off. I had lunch with somebody 2 days ago who grew up in Wichita, Kansas, lamenting about the fact that Boeing just closed a plant and moved on. And what was the morning news, either this morning or yesterday? They've closed another one and moved it on. And I'm not saying you don't look at things in terms of what's viable, what isn't. I don't know the particulars of that, but I do believe that having stronger local control to control your destiny and to be able to implement values that are shared in a community is clearly the way to go.
I will close this to an end. If you wish to ask more questions to Bill, I invite you to see him. And thank you, Bill, for...
My pleasure.